as a historian, as an educator, as a learner, the use of historical inquiry in the context of free and enslaved Africans in colonial and pre-revolutionary America.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly what I'm going to be talking about in my section. I'm going to be talking about how do you get to have students get to do actual historical work? What kinds of sources could they use to build teachers to build a curriculum where they're doing the same kind of work that Chernow is doing and that Bethany's doing at a different level, where they're coming up with good historical questions, where they're looking at primary and secondary sources, and they're investigating what really is a different perspective on the American Revolution than is sort of the traditional approach. A lot of that is what we get, from Ray Raphael. We get his sort of narrative of it, but how do you actually do that kind of work? If you want to look at, what happened at Tybee Island, for example, how would you go about doing that? And I'm going to pose in my session a lesson about writing an essay using a number of sources. I'm going to talk about the sources and then a more very traditional essay. It could be done another way. It could be done as a film. It could be done as like a National History Day project. But how do we think about that? And I'm going to start off by actually talking about The Patriot, the film The Patriot, and use David Hackett Fisher's wonderful essay in the New York Times, his review of the film The Patriot, called Hubris, Not History. So I'm sort of telling you what I'm going to be talking about. But when we start our filming, we haven't started recording now, or I guess we have it. When we officially start, I would say, we could start by thinking about what questions to ask. How do we approach thinking about African Americans? We've talked about women, we've talked about children. African Americans provides a different perspective and again, another multifaceted perspective. They're not all joining the revolutionary cause. They're not all joining the loyalist cause. A lot of them it doesn't have much impact on them in the front end, but it will have tremendous impact on them with the consequence of the decline of the plantation system. And then, of course, we have a resurgence of the plantation system. But, during the revolutionary moment, it's a decline of the plantation system. So those are the kinds of questions that I would raise in thinking about religion, Freemasonry, community. Anyway, I'm sort of jumping into it. I should be holding back.
No, not at all. I mean, this is kind of like a open conversation, open dialogue. So that's I think it just makes it for greater interest, in this topic. I think for me, reading Raphael's chapter on African Americans and then thinking back on Chernow's conversation, to me, the question for me has always been something about, or something to the effect of the relationships between free and enslaved persons, the relationships with the white colonists, the plantation owners in the South, their masters in the North, and then the British, right? The British relationship with British officials, the royal governors, and an assumption that if you provided your service to the British, you would be set free. And that is not necessarily the case, right? There is this sense of or this level of uncertainty in terms of what to do, in the situation. If you are an enslaved person, and you have your family with you, what are the consequences of the actions and decisions you make? That has that must be very, very hard to, I can't imagine what you're going to have to accept the outcome, whatever that might be. It could be death. It could be, lifelong, in the labor camps or wherever, or it's been resold. And so, I don't know. I think, trying to present that kind of human element
Mhm.
story, hopefully students will gain a greater appreciation of, uh, um, decisions, the decisions that they made, um,
Mhm.
and just survive. And I think to me that is, I want to learn. I want to know more about that. And so I don't know. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not a scholar in this, but definitely, I want to hear your take.
For me, I think about sort of teaching objectives, right? And I want students to understand that enslaved and free people of African descent had an impact on the revolutionary moment, right? A really direct impact on it.
Yes.
And so that goes to looking at what I'm sure you were talking about with Cherno, right? Black participation in the war, right? In the revolutionary moment. I want students to understand that enslaved people found agency, right, in the revolutionary moment, and were able to that enslaved people made arguments for their own freedom. And I always use that great petition to General Gage from the free and enslaved people of Boston in my class. It's really drawing on the language of the revolution to argue for their own freedom. So I want folks to understand that there's agency, but there's also limitations. And I think that goes to what you're talking about, Gorman, right? That every sort of opportunity that the sort of chaos of the revolution might present, it also presents a risk or a limitation, right? Do you join the British in the hopes of freedom? Well, that probably depends on a bunch of different things. Do you have a family? How tied are you? Do you try to, how strongly do you advocate for your own freedom? Do you try to use the chaos of the war to sort of run away, right? That all of this sort of agency comes with limitations that's based on status and the sort of context of being an enslaved person in the 18th century. I always think of Berlin. Ira Berlin has a great line in the preface to Understanding and Teaching American Slavery, where it's something like, on the narrowest of grounds and on the thinnest of margins, right, enslaved people made choices, right, for themselves, tried to sort of operate and make decisions. And then
that's a great quote to pack out. That's a great quote to unpack.
Yeah.
I think Berlin's context and helping people sort of see who Berlin is, his Many Thousands Gone and all of his great work. How does that bring that into the conversation?
Yeah, and it's just such a great way to think about it, right? Because it's not this unlimited opportunity. It's not, it's choices within a very narrow range of choices, but still people are making them, right, to determine their futures as much as possible. And then the last thing I want my students to understand is that the presence of enslaved and free African and African American people, right, has an impact on the revolutionary moment, even when we're talking about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams, right? Even when we're talking about what we think of as that traditional narrative, that the decisions that those people are making, the way that they're framing and phrasing the documents that they're creating, is in part, right, a response to, or at least it's within the context of a slaveholding society. Right. And so we can't really look at the Constitution without looking at it within this context of this is a society, right, where people are enslaved. We can't look at, arguments about freedom and liberty in Massachusetts, right, and the metaphor of slavery that comes up so often without thinking of, well, people use the metaphor of slavery for a reason. They use it because they know what slavery is. They see it around them and they say, well, this is a bad thing, right? And so this metaphor has meaning then. And so I like to think of, even if we're talking about something as sort of traditional as, the Second Continental Congress, right? We're still thinking the context of slavery in those men's lives, right, is still an important piece to remember as we're considering that, the actions that they took and the things that they created. Yeah. Paul Finkelman does, I think, a really good job of tying this. I think it's in his Slavery and the Founders, and when he's talking about Jefferson, and I think we see this in Massachusetts even after 1783, when there's a sort of unofficial end of slavery in Massachusetts, where I think the problem for many of the founders is that while they recognize the hypocrisy of, arguing for their own liberty while keeping others enslaved, and we know it was pointed out to them on several, occasions. Lafayette harangued Washington about it, for his entire life. Right. Jefferson had several conversations with, George Wythe and others about it. I think the problem for the founders, as sort of Finkelman puts it out with Jefferson, is, yes, we can recognize this hypocrisy, but we can't imagine a democracy, right, a democratically elected republic, where people of African descent are not enslaved, right? What would be the role then of formerly enslaved people in this new republic? And for many, right, the prejudice and the racism and the idea that people of African descent, African people were less than, were not equal to the task of being members of that democracy, right, is really the stumbling block. And we see that right up through Lincoln, right? I mean, even Lincoln is concerned about that, and up until 1863 or so. Yeah. So I think the problem is the presence of people of color in the nation, right? And then what would be their role? Finkelman, I don't believe I'm putting words in his mouth. I think, he says, Thomas Jefferson, may have hated slavery, but he hated slavery because it brought African people, right, to what would become the United States, and into, and they're sort of the kind of downfall of, right, the nation he's creating in his mind.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think this becomes a seed kernel for the colonization movement. Where should the Africans go if these former enslaved Africans are amongst us? Ought they go to the Caribbean somewhere? Can we set up a colony there? Would it be, Jamaica? Where would it be? Somewhere else? And then, of course, it ends up being former enslaved Americans who will go to Britain and then be incubators for Sierra Leone and eventually from here Liberia. Mm-hmm. So, and that is seen for some as a solution, right? And that's a complicated story because it involves a lot of agency of former enslaved and free African Americans who took that power, took that opportunity, were willing to get on a ship and go to Sierra Leone eventually, or then later to Liberia. We don't want to undercut that, and yet at the same time we see a kind of racism, institutionalized racism of separating these people can't possibly live together, as a driving force between that. So giving full recognition to the agency, which you talked about before, Bethany, is central to this question. It's easy to sort of dismiss the colonization society and say, oh, well, that was racist. But then if you look at it from the story of Africans who were involved, African Americans who were involved with it, it becomes a much more complicated story.
Yeah, and there's great documents that I've used in my class, and certain people saying, look, I've tried to make a way here. There's no, I can't do it. This country doesn't work for us. And so, sure, I'd love to go somewhere else, whether it's somewhere in the Western United States, a state reserved, right, for African-American people, or whether it's totally out of the country. You can see that debate within the African-American community as well, which I think it's always nice to find those sort of voices. None of this is ever easy, right, right. To suss out, yeah.
But particularly in the elementary level, what are your perspectives, both of you, in terms of what are some things that teachers can do to incorporate this topic with elementary students?
I just want to, Bethany, I want to give you a full time on this one, but I just want to jump in and just say a couple of things just to sort of maybe help both of us, all of us, think about this. And a little story. Years ago, when I was the head of a second grade through 12th grade history curriculum as a department chair, the second grade framework, second, third grade framework was changing, and suddenly the teachers were having to teach about the Incas and Aztecs and Mayas. And these two wonderful teachers came to me who were just absolutely wonderful magicians in many ways, but skill, not magic. It was skill they had and craft. Came to me and said, "Look, we know nothing about these Incas, Aztecs, and Mayas. What can we do? What do we do?" And I said, "Well, look, you guys know how to teach it. What I can do is give you some stories." And they just both looked at me and said, "That's how we teach it, through stories."
Yeah.
If you point us to resources for stories, you help us understand and unpack these stories, we know how to teach it. So I think the answer there is, when thinking about the revolution and African Americans, I'm going to be talking later a little bit about the story of David George. And unpacking that, coming out of a number of sources, including Maya Jasanoff's wonderful work on Liberty's Exiles. If you have a story in Massachusetts like Mom Bet or Quack Walker, or I'll be talking later about Agrippa Hall, which comes out of Gary Nash's book on the Forgotten Fifth. Those stories like that we'll be getting to later today are rich with the complication. And for a second grader or a third grader or a fifth grader, they can hear that story, and teachers can help them understand a life that was lived. And suddenly a complicated story becomes much richer and more understandable to a third or fifth grade kid. Bethany, I want to, you deal with teachers who are going into the third and fifth grade classroom all the time, and I'm sure they'll be back to you. What are you hearing? And what do you?
Well, my crew is more middle and high.
Okay.
But I will say, teaching hard history, the next iteration of the frameworks that are coming out are K through 5 for the Teaching Hard History American Slavery frameworks, and they've done a really good job of thinking about how do we go from sort of students' lived experience, right? Ideas about community, ideas about self and other, right? How do we go from those ideas that students are sort of emotionally, ready for and learning about in these grades, and then tie that back to then investigating more complex and diverse narratives, and particularly about American slavery. I know that they have, to get to your point, Charlie, about stories, I know that they have contracted for some new, fiction book, not fiction, but, new storybooks to read, because so much of how elementary school teachers need to teach history because of the time constraints, right, is as an extension of English language arts. Right, so the stories not only becomes a way to connect to students, but it also becomes a way that as teachers, they can sort of kill two birds with one stone. I can teach the Maya, and I can also teach how stories are structured, right, for my students. So that's sort of the two pieces of that. I find that, when I'm talking to my kids, my daughters are twins, and they're going into third grade, right? I have a son who's in seventh grade. When I talk to them, they really get notions of fair and unfair, right? And so if we sometimes sort of just talk about slavery in its very basic terms, right, of fairness, of being, having the rights to, Lincoln, who says, every man should enjoy the fruits of his own labor, right? If we talk about it in those terms with students to get them to understand the concept, right, then they're ready to sort of go with us on that, right, on this journey to understanding it a little bit more.
I think it goes back to what you're saying, what Chirna Sase was saying. When those of you who haven't seen Chirna Sase's interview that we have with him, one of the things that he emphasized was the role of community. And Bethany, that sort of resonated with what you were saying. And we used to talk about as expanding horizons in the lower grades, right? You've got yourself, and then you've got your community, and then it goes out to your state, and then it goes out to the state nation, and then eventually the world. But I think thinking about community with the context of again thinking about African Americans and the American Revolution, Sasse makes really clear that it was about community. It wasn't about one person as a leader. And I think he helps us complexify even the founding fathers and mothers by saying it's not just about the founding father or mother. They're part of a wider community too. So in some ways, this is having, if you will, the underrepresented voices history change the way we think about all of history.
And that reminds me of what I was going to say. Which is just, it's like we planned it, which is just sort of being mindful to include these stories, that the first time we teach the revolution, it shouldn't be completely absent, right? African-American people. When we talk about colonial Massachusetts with our students, we shouldn't just talk about, Thanksgiving and then flip to 1763, right? We should talk about, we should talk about slavery in Massachusetts. We should talk about the presence, right? African-American people or people of African descent have always been here. They should be part of our stories. So when I get to students in college, sometimes even, and we start talking about these histories, many of them are often annoyed, right? That this is the first time they're really getting to sort of delve into these other stories. And I think what worries middle and high school teachers sometimes about talking about the sort of much more kind of complex and full narrative of slavery and freedom and racism is they feel like they're coming from nowhere and destroying students' sort of previous ideas about American history, right? That if students have only ever been taught this sort of very celebratory narrative of American history, then this more complex picture not only can be difficult emotionally because it's a hard story to talk about, but it can be, sort of disorienting for students, right? And so if we can back up into the elementary grades, right, and start including people like Belinda, right, and Belinda's petition from the Royal House that folks will see in August, if we can include that story, then our students are sort of more aware, right, in age-appropriate and accessible ways of the existence of slavery, of the existence of African-American people in these across a sort of full history of Massachusetts, of the United States. I also think back when I was first teaching at Salem State, and I was talking to history education students about this kind of work. And, I sort of posed this, kind of hypothetical question of, well, if we don't talk about this in our classrooms, what do you think that your students of color feel, right, if they never see themselves represented in the story, right? If American history seems absent of anybody who looked like them. And there was a young man in my class who was like, I felt invisible, right? I felt alone. I felt like I must have come out of nowhere because I didn't see myself anywhere else in this story, right? So also being mindful that those little kids in our class, whether they know it or not, right, are looking for a familiar, right, or when they're thinking about self, they're thinking about where is somebody in this story that looks like me or I can relate to. And so whether it's women, Native Americans, right, young people, or African Americans, I think it's important.
I think that's a really key point. That's so important. I have a number of students who are Dominican Americans. And suddenly when we talk about Columbus and we read a history of Hispaniola, they're excited. Wait a minute, this is history about Hispaniola, which is about the DR today. Now, they don't know the history. They don't know any of that history any more than anybody else does. right? But they're excited because they can relate to it in some ways. They can at least see a piece of themselves in it, which also brings me back to another thing that Chirna Sase said, which is the importance of genealogy and how genealogy can be a pathway into this for kids. I think that's maybe particularly true for, maybe 5th grade and 8th grade kids can get to do genealogy. 3rd grade's maybe a little young, but it seems to me that they can, and there are some resources for that. There's the wonderful film that came out, Traces of the Trade, Katrina Brown's great film about her doing genealogy and the family, the DeWolf family, looking at the history of slavery in the North and its connections to Brown University. Kids can get excited, I think. I can see that as a very appropriate 5th or 8th grade film to show. Or looking at what resources are on there and archives, or looking at this Henry Louis Gates wonderful videos about genealogy. If you're thinking about that and then you turn to the revolution, or you turn to the revolution then turn to that, they could go nicely hand in hand, and you realize that genealogy is not just for white wealthy people.
And I was just reading Stony the Road a little while ago, Henry Louis Gates, and he talks about part of the impetus for that book, and I think I'm remembering this correctly, but I may not be, was when he did Finding Your Roots, and I think it was with Chris Rock, and Chris Rock's ancestor of, I don't remember the relation, but was one of the first sort of Black representatives, either state representatives or federal representative from, during Reconstruction. And he had no idea. Yeah. Right. And this, right? Chris Rock had no idea that he was related to this person, and not a real full idea that that moment had even happened. And so Henry Louis Gates talks about, well, if those of us with a personal connection to this history are unaware of it, right, then we as a nation, right, must be very unaware of it. And so we need to sort of examine this complicated, history of Reconstruction and Black agency within Reconstruction, and not just, not just the story of failure and the eventual quote unquote redemption of it.
Right. I just want to chime in and say, hold us up. I was looking for it. Some of the things that are resources that are out there are, things like this. This is the African American Heritage Trail. This is from the Trustees of Reservations, and this is Mumbet's Trail. So Mumbet was talked about in the reading, and I'll talk more about Mumbet later as well. But there are great things like this for middle school, and I think 6th, 3rd grade. It's hard to get out of the classroom, I know. But boy, that's fun. Yeah. And great resources like this have been put together. So anyway, I just wanted to, before we go on from 3rd and 5th grade, point out that field trips, there's nothing like taking a group of 3rd graders or 5th graders to a site to have them really feel it and get some empathy going and some real connection. You stand in a room where Mumbet was an enslaved person, you suddenly are thinking about Mumbet in a different way, and you understand why she changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman.
Yeah. Tufts is also doing and they're mapping African American sites. They have a whole digital project, which I'm not sure. I've looked at the sort of brochure like what you had for Mumbet, Charlie. I haven't looked at the online presence for it, but whether it's something that you could even do in a classroom, right? Kind of have your students Google mapping their way through some of these heritage trails if you can't get out of the classroom.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was at the SHEAR conference last weekend, and there were some people there who were talking about that from Tufts, and that they're really vamping it up even more. So great resource, and I'll see if I can get the URL, and so Gorman can put it up. So thank you for reminding us all of that.